Hello, welcome to the Princess Grace Irish Library, and a very special welcome to Martina Devlin, who's here with me today. Martina is an award-winning author, playwright, and journalist as well. And her portfolio of work includes 8 novels and 2 plays. Prizes include from the Royal Society of Literature and the Hennessy Literary Award. Martina is currently hosting the City of Books podcast for the Dublin UNESCO City of Literature. And she's the first holder of a PhD in literary practice from Trinity College Dublin, where she lectures in Irish literature. And also in 2009, Martina was writer in residence at the Princess Grace Irish Library in Monaco. So you are very familiar with where I'm sitting now. So welcome, Martina. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back in Monaco, if virtually.
Exactly. Well, wonderful. And it's a great month to be talking to, because we'll have our Bloomsday next week. And you're very involved in that. But first, I just wanted to mention your latest novel is a novel about Edith, and that's the Irish RM writer Edith Somerville. And also your recent play, Curves of Emotion, is about James Joyce and his wife and muse, Nora. So we'd love to hear a little bit about that as well, given our theme this year is around Ulysses because of the centenary. So that's wonderful. So if we could start maybe with your new novel based on the life of Edith, and I'll just give a little bit of background to our listeners here. So Edith was a part of the writing duo Somerville and Ross, and authors of the Irish RM. And this story of these 2 women writers who are best-selling authors is very unique in the history of Irish women writers. They were late 19th century feminists, single, educated, and economically independent writers. So we're looking forward to hear about that. So can we kick off with a question, Martina? When is your book set?
Well, the novel takes 1 year in the life of Edith Somerville. It's set in 1921-22 against a backdrop of the War of Independence and the beginning of the Civil War in Ireland. So it's the convulsions of the revolutionary movement. And Edith was from the big house tradition. So theoretically, she could have felt no longer welcome in Ireland. Big houses were being burned down. And the novel follows her decision to stay in Ireland and why. But I became very interested in Edith Somerville and Violet Martin, her co-author, who wrote as Martin Ross, for a number of reasons. They were Victorian ladies who charted the demise of their ascendancy class even as it was happening, and we see that in their novels and short story collections. The best known of their work is the Irish RM series. There were 3 collections of those stories, and they were interesting to me because Ross was a unionist while Somerville developed nationalist loyalties. And then they worked in partnership, the dual voices combining to create one memorable voice that was highly unusual. And they understood the value of authentic dialect, and they used to scribble down sayings to seed their work with. In fact, they'd go to court hearings in the nearby town and sit at the back of the court and write away. And because, I mean, there was just wonderful expressions there, and also great plots for their books. Indeed. And then they were very humorous. They understood humor, and that wasn't so common for women. And finally, they insisted on being treated as professional writers, not dilettantes. And they had one of the first literary agents, and they really demanded to be treated with respect. So for these reasons, I was interested in Somerville and Ross as a writing duo, but the novel takes place after Ross is dead. She died in 1915, and Edith Somerville had a crisis where she wondered, could she continue writing at all? And she came up with an intriguing way of getting past that wobble. And she convinced herself that she was collaborating beyond the grave via spiritualism with Ross, and that the two of them were still writing the books. I believe she was sincere in that conviction. Her agent and her publisher just pretended to go along with it because it created a mystery, and mystery is good for business.
Indeed. And did they continue to publish under the two names?
Yes, yes. Well, Edith was doing it herself, of course.
Right, of
But
course.
you see, it was clever as well, because
but the publishers allowed it, you were saying.
Yeah. Yes, the publishers allowed it, but it was quite clever of her, because there was a brand name, a market for Somerville and Ross, but there might not have been for Edith Somerville writing alone. So, you know, it made perfect sense. And of course, at least to her. And then the other thing is that the idea of automatic writing and spiritualism sounds very odd to many people today. But at that time, there were others experimenting with it. W.B. Yeats famously drew a lot of inspiration from the automatic writing that his wife did, and Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories and lots of other work besides, was also very interested in spiritualism. And we have to remember at that time, people were open to new ideas. They didn't quite understand things such as, you know, could telepathy happen? They were interested in reincarnation. So it was in a spirit of exploration, really.
Right. And could you explain a little bit the automatic writing you referred to?
How it works? Well, some people also call it trance writing. And the belief is that you go into a kind of a light trance, you hold a pen or a pencil very loosely, and then the words you write on the page are not coming from you, they're being channeled by a spirit. And Edith really believed that Martin was speaking to her that way. But of course, the thing is, she'd inherited Martin's literary, sorry, I call her Martin, it's Martin Ross or Violet Martin. Edith always spoke, you know, referred to her as Martin. So she believed she'd inherited her literary archive, and she believed that they were collaborating. But in fact, she had all their notes and their letters and their manuscripts and their ideas for books. So it was a kind of a collaboration, just perhaps not from beyond the grave.
Right, indeed. And speaking of letters, you include some letters in your novel. Are these real letters, or have you fictionalized anything?
Mostly they're fictionalized, although Somerville and Ross were Victorian ladies, part of the great letter writing and diary keeping tradition, which is wonderful, a boon for a novelist, because you have their unmediated words. You know, biography or even autobiography is treated in a particular way, but letters are closer to text messages today. And so we see the unmediated voice. And the letters, there is one letter in particular in the novel, which is a real one. It was from George Bernard Shaw to Edith. She wrote a play based on the Irish RM stories called Fleury's Wedding. I came across it in the course of my PhD, and academics kind of knew about it, but attention wasn't paid to it because it was never performed. So it was always just mentioned in a glancing way. And I found a letter in the archive in Droshan House, where Edith grew up, a house that's still lived in by Somervilles in West Cork in Castle Townsend. And it was from Shaw to Edith. Now, a relative of Edith's was married to Shaw, and she had sent the play to him for, I suppose, a bit of help, and maybe she thought he'd get it on in the West End for her. At that time, he was, you know, extraordinarily successful. And soon after reading Edith's play, he was working on St. Joan, one of his great works about Joan of Arc. So there's his response in the archive. We don't have the original letter she sent, but we have his response, and it is uncompromising. I mean, he basically tells her that she's too ladylike to be a writer, and he can't bear Fleury Locks. He thinks of him as a dastardly horse thief, and he thinks it's appalling that poor old Sally Knox should be his love interest. He doesn't have much of a sense of humor about the Irish RM. So he basically tells her to give up. So I used that letter. Now, she didn't give up. She tried very hard to get the play put on. I suppose it was a way for her to keep going. She'd had this wobble, lost her confidence. The Irish RM stories were their most successful commercially and critically work. And she needed money at that time as well. The Troubles, as we call them euphemistically in Ireland, in between 1919 and 1922, were ongoing, and the market for selling horses, which was a source of income to her, had collapsed. The market for books wasn't as good as it was. She was a farmer as well. That market had collapsed. So she was looking for ways to make money. And of course, as well, the big houses no longer had income from tenant farmers by this stage. We talk about revolution in Ireland, and we often think of it as that, say, 1916 Easter Rising up until the formation of the state period. But in fact, the real revolution in Irish life was after the Land War and the Land Act, where swathes of the country were handed over to tenant farmers, the people who'd been farming them. And so that meant that the gentry class no longer had an income to run these big houses. So Edith was a product of that and was looking for other ways to make money. I should say, though, that she always wanted to be self-sufficient anyway, and in fact loved this gorgeous house, Trishan House, and poured the income from her writing into it. And I believe it's still in Somerville hands today because of her insistence that it should be. She stayed when others were bailing out in those difficult years. She stayed. She was a constant presence in the house, well liked in the village, and saved the house.
Right. That's amazing. And I'm curious where the archives are, and where were you doing your research when you were writing the book? Was it did Trinity have any archives, or where are most of them based?
Yes, well, there's a wonderful archive in Trishan House. It's a private archive. There are nearly 4,000 items there, from family letters to objects. As the novelist in me is very inspired by objects. So they have the most charming little museum in what used to be Edith's studio. And there are things like a great big straw sun hat she wore, her riding boots, little portable easel she'd carry about with her for sketching, manuscripts, of course. And the wonderful thing about her manuscripts is there are doodles on the side, because she was an artist as well as a writer, a very good artist. Her work hangs in Trishan House and in the Crawford Gallery in Cork and in other places. And so you can see her scribbles and her doodles and her artwork. So that's quite inspiring. Then there is also material in Trinity College, as you say, Paula. The most wonderful letters between Somerville and Ross and their agent, Mr. Pinker. I grew so fond of Mr. Pinker, and I could see how these ladies operated. They were terribly charming and had the best sense of humor, and they were always sending letters to Mr. Pinker, as they called him. His name was James Brand Pinker in London, and he was one of the first literary agents, and he had a who's who in his stable, from Arnold Bennett to Henry James to James Joyce as well for a time. And the letters to him always went something like, "Dear Mr. Pinker, I do hope you're well. I do hope Mrs. Pinker's well. I have some horses to sell. Would you ever ask around and see if anyone would like a particularly fine hunter?" And then there'd be a description of the horse.
Oh,
and
my
then
goodness.
It would be, Miss
There's
Martin
went beyond the publishing.
Oh no,
role.
friendship. Yeah, it was
friendship as well. Yeah.
And then they'd get down to the nitty gritty, though, Paul, and they'd say something like, "Miss Martin and I believe we are due this amount in royalties. Swift payment would be such a help to hard-pressed authors." And they'd have computed it exactly. And so there's lots of that there. And then perhaps the most important place for their archive is in Queen's University, Belfast. In the 1960s, Edith's literary heirs sold the collection at auction. And there was a real risk it would have been split and gone all over the place and perhaps into private hands. But fortunately, most of it, not all, was bought by Queen's University Belfast. It's very well catalogued and looked after there. And I was able to go and do research at the coalface there. And that's where I found not just one copy of the play she'd written, Fleury's Wedding, but multiple iterations. And she tinkered with it over a 17-year period. She was never able to get it staged, but each of the versions are fascinating, at least for me. I'm a bit of an Edith addict, because you could see social history unfurl there. Early examples of the play, for example, have Sally Knox, Fleury's love interest. Fleury, of course, famously was the half sir, and he rode rings around poor old Major Yates, the Irish RM. So initially, Sally Knox rides up to Fleury's house on horseback. But as time passes, we see her chauffeur driven there. And then as well as time passes and there are different versions, we see her taking up smoking, which obviously in 1951, a nicely brought up gal wouldn't dream of doing.
Right. So over the 17-year period, she had to keep updating it to keep up with the modern trends. Yeah.
And to try and get it placed as well, but she never did. Partly because it's not really a very good play. She was an excellent short story writer and novelist. She wrote very good essays, but playwriting is a different matter entirely. And also she was a bit unfortunate with timing, Paula, because if she had tried to have the play staged a little earlier, she may well have been successful, but she was trying in 1922 and onwards. And by that stage, Britain and Ireland had been at war, and Britain had fallen out of love with frothy Irish frolics. It didn't want to stage them.
Right, yeah, so very just bad timing for her, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, covering all the genre novels and plays, and you've succeeded it with your own play. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Covering the Ulysses aspect and James Joyce. Why did you decide, given how difficult a lot of authors find it, to follow in the footsteps of the great James Joyce? How did you find the courage? You certainly had the talent, but there's courage behind there too.
Oh, I felt the fear and did it anyway.
Wonderful.
Well, it was an attempt to do two things: to separate out Joyce the man from Joyce the legend. That was one element. But I was very interested in Nora Barnacle Joyce. I'm fascinated by women who are scrubbed out or sidelined or remembered in a two-dimensional way. And I wrote a short story collection, particularly to feature women such as that. And Nora Joyce, for me, is one of them. She was Joyce's muse. She's described memorably as his portable Ireland. And he acid stripped her life and her expressions for his art. And I wanted to give her back her due. Sometimes people downgrade her and say, oh, she wasn't interested in his work, and he was this great man and she was not a particularly well-educated girl and there was a class difference. People can be quite dismissive of her, but I find her absolutely fascinating and fun and well worth exploring. So that's very much what the play is about. It's set on one day. It's on publication day in 1922. Joyce has just turned 40 and he chose his birthday in February as the publication date for Ulysses, for good luck, because he was very superstitious about dates.
Right.
So I have the couple together.
Yeah, you described the day. Is that what actually happens?
Well, no, I have to confess, hands up, it's fiction. But I did include some fact, like, for example, it is his birthday, and Sylvia Beach, who published Ulysses first, did deliver the first copy to their apartment in Paris. and they went out to a small celebration dinner that night, and Joyce had the book brought along with him. He had it bound in a plain blue cover with white letters because blue and white were his lucky colors. He was terribly superstitious, so he brought the book with him for the dinner. And but the play is really two of them exploring their relationship, talking about going out later and talking about the play, but it's looking at their life together, because it occurred to me it must have been difficult enough being married to a great man, a self-styled genius, and of course he was a genius as well. He moved them from pillar to post. It was a rackety life for long enough, and money was tight. And Nora must have been the one having to smile at tradesmen and landlords and buy them extra time. Joyce drank heavily as well, and that can't have been easy. And she kept it all together, kept the family together. And I wanted to look at that, and also to reflect on whether she was happy with it.
Right, indeed. You're right. I mean, this year we seem to be seeing a lot of Nora's side of things, which is adding a wonderful new element to it, because everybody knows his brother Stanislas, and the shoulder, his shoulder was leaned on, and we've heard so much about that. So this is wonderful to have a new perspective from Nora's point of view. And
Brenda Maddox did a brilliant job writing a biography of Nora. I think we're all
we have that here, several couples here. Come back.
Yeah. It's a wonderful biography. And then Nuala O'Connor also did a brilliant job vivifying Nora in her novel Nora, which was the One Dublin One book.
Absolutely, yeah. And we had Nuala here talking about Nora last.
She's a great speaker.
It was wonderful, yeah. So all of you wonderful women writers are adding to that. It's just fantastic, and a new archive regarding that. I'm just wondering now, in terms of what interests you about figures from history as opposed to writing about the present day, just to talk, focus on you as a writer yourself.
That's a good question. I sometimes interrogate myself and say, why are you writing about historical fiction? Historical figures rather than writing contemporary fiction. I think we can learn from the past. And if we don't learn lessons from the past, we're doomed to repeat mistakes. So, for example, what interested me about Edith Somerville was that she was an early adopter of hybrid identity. She defined herself as British and Irish, and she did that 76 years before the Good Friday Agreement, which gave people permission to say, I am British and I am Irish and I am neither, or I am both, or I'm one or the other. She came up with that, and I think it was extraordinary. And I think hybridity is a positive thing. I mean, ask a gardener. Darwin made the case for it. But sometimes we can be very purist about national identity. And Edith just sidestepped all that. So I find it interesting, and I believe that we can learn lessons from that. Then why else am I interested in these women? Well, I wrote a short story about Countess Markievicz, a 1916 revolutionary. It's in my collection, Truth and Dare, and then I adapted it as a play, which has just actually been published this month. It's called Call Me Madam, which is what she liked to be addressed as, not Countess, or whatever the appropriate designation is. It was Madam, which was an ode to the French. Thank you. It was an ode to the French Revolution, in fact. The women at this time liked to be known as Madam Sheehy Skeffington, or Madam Markievicz, Madam Gifford, and so on. And I was interested in her because I thought, what would she make of Ireland today? She helped to found the Republic. How would Countess Markievicz feel about the state that developed? And
Right.
so I brought her back from the dead to cast a cold eye on political progress and the fact that there hasn't been a female Taoiseach in a century of the state. And I have this young activist say, "What should we do, madam?" And she
Right.
advises the young activist to take a leaf out of the suffragettes book and cause a disturbance.
Oh, that's wonderful. And can we see your play in Ireland? How is it being?
Well, so it was performed on a number of occasions in 2019 to mark the centenary of Countess Markiewicz's appointment as the first female government minister. She was Minister for Labour.
Right.
And so there were a number of performances then, and the book, a text of the play has just been published, so perhaps someone else will take it on and perform it. I'd certainly like it. I sometimes do readings from it and people enjoy it, but then I moved on to do the Joyce play, and that's being performed at the moment, and hopefully will going on forward. There are two super actors in the role, her husband and wife in real life, and then playing this Joyce and Nora Barnacle, who did eventually marry in the 1930s, seems to give it some extra va-va-voom.
That's fantastic. And where is that on?
Different places, Dunleary, Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin. It's going on in Listowel, St. John's Theatre in Listowel in July.
Okay. Oh, we'll mark down the dates for anyone listening in, and in Ireland. That would be wonderful. And one day it'd be lovely to have you do some readings here from the library.
Oh, my pleasure.
It would be wonderful.
I have such happy memories of my time in the Princess Grace Irish Library. I was made so welcome by the community there. And what I remember particularly is the books in the library that belonged to Princess Grace. I remember your lovely predecessor, Judith, taking down books and showing me Grace Kelly in her schoolgirl handwriting. I mean, obviously it wasn't always schoolgirl handwriting, but
Yes.
her own personal books, and one as well from her uncle, who was a playwright.
Indeed, George Kelly. Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy that you, exactly, because I do visits for people coming in and show them those books, and it just really opens up a whole other side of Princess Grace, and it's lovely to hear that. Wonderful. And of course, we've lots of the limited edition and first edition of Ulysses 1922 on display here. So it's wonderful that you were able to add to that conversation around Ulysses and James Joyce. Thank you so much, Martina, for your time. And we look forward to another collaboration. Wonderful. We'll talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.